All right. Let me make sure this is working. Magic and intelligence work would appear on the surface to be an unlikely combination, but as the partnership between the dark arts and the agency evolved, the craft of magic and the CIA's need for clandestine operations locked together like the last two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. From Tony Mendez, former CIA chief of disguise. Guys, I'm not answering the phone or messages or anything all day, so don't bother messaging me, please. Deception is a state of mind, and the mind of the state. James Jesus Angleton. Everybody should know who he is. Chief of Counterintelligence 54 to 74. This is a fascinating quote from Marina Oswald. I had two husbands, Lee, the father of my children, an affectionate and kind man, and Harvey Oswald, the assassin of President Kennedy. I immensely pity Lee, my husband, but I did not feel anything with regard to Oswald, the assassin. That Oswald was a madman. Now, the photographs I'm about to show you are Lee Oswald, the real Lee Oswald, as we were presented up until basically 1959. Going back to approximately 1953, April-ish of 1953, we are introduced to another person who we are told is Lee Oswald. That person is not. The photograph in the upper left, that's Oswald in New York in 52, followed by Beauregard High School in 54, 55 school year, followed by Lee Oswald in the Civil Air Patrol in 1955, 56. And I need to make a very distinct point here. This person you're seeing who was part of the Civil Air Patrol who knew David Ferrie is most certainly not the Lee Oswald who was in New Orleans post-June of 62. So when everyone says that Lee Oswald knew David Ferrie from the Civil Air Patrol, that is blatantly false. The person they're referring to is not the person who was raised Lee Harvey Oswald. The next photograph is another extremely important photograph. That's from Lee Oswald's graduation from the aircraft warning operator class, which was, everyone thinks that Oswald was a radar operator. That is blatantly and provably false, and we'll get into that later on. That photograph was taken June 18th, 1954, as he graduated from that school. The following photograph on the lower left is the rarest photograph you'll ever see of the real Lee Harvey Oswald. The only place I've ever seen this photograph is stashed inside the John Armstrong files. The next photograph is also Lee Harvey Oswald at Atsugi, Japan. The following photograph after that is Lee Harvey Oswald as he was photographed by his brother, probably in 1958, although Robert Oswald has changed the date that photograph was taken twice, indicating three different dates: February 58, December 58, and then September 59. I believe it was actually December 58, which is very problematic. The final photograph here is the last known photograph of this man. This was taken in September 10th, 1959, and it appeared on Lee Harvey Oswald's passport. Does that look anything like the man that you saw arrested on November 22nd, 1963? Now we're going to talk about Harvey Oswald, which to some degree appears to be a play on words, but in actuality is not. This is the man who was arrested on November 22nd, 1963. And this man, throughout most of his life, between 1953 and the end, introduced himself to people as Harvey Oswald. Not Lee Oswald, Harvey Oswald. Now, while this might seem ridiculous on its face, this is part of a large-scale Office of Naval Intelligence identity transfer operation that was pulled off in collaboration with the CIA via their defection programs, AE Balcony and Redskin, which are the programs that were governing the false defector programs. The photograph on the top left is, we'll call him for the sake of this presentation, Harvey Oswald, because that's what he called himself. That's Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, photograph taken by Robert Oswald, which is a clear indicator Robert Oswald was in on this deception. And not only was he in on this deception, there were times in his life that he himself went by Lee Oswald, which we'll see as we move forward. The second picture is from Arlington Heights High School, where Oswald dropped out in October of 1956 before joining the Marines. The following two photos are photographs of Harvey Oswald while he was in the Marines. And these two photographs bring up a lot of questions. The photograph on the top right is allegedly from Corregidor, which is Philippines, taken in 1957. But We know from the records that Oswald never made it to Corregidor until the end of January 1958. So we'll cover all that. The bottom two on the left are from Minsk. Some people will argue that the person on the bottom left is actually another person, but I don't know that I'd go that far. But there are distinct differences in the appearance of this man and the man who was also photographed in the other Minsk photographs. Then the last two photographs are Oswald when he was arrested August 9th, 1963 in New Orleans, and November 22nd, 1963 after the assassination of the president. Now, if you look at the photograph from Arlington High School and you look at the photograph of the man arrested on August 9th in New Orleans, it's clearly the same person. The profile is identical, right? So, however, that is most certainly not this man here, the real Lee Harvey Oswald. These are Oswald's passport photos. First one's from LA 1959. That's the last known photograph of this man. Unless you believe Robert Oswald, who said he took a photograph with the rifle at duck hunting with his basically in-laws in Texas in 1959 September, but I don't buy that. Doesn't make sense at all. I believe that photograph is from 1958. Clearly, these do not look like the same men. Comparison of the Minsk 1962 photo to LA 1959. That's some of the most stark contrast you're ever going to see. Even the ears are different. This is the real Lee Harvey Oswald in the Marines. All three photographs here were taken at Atsugi, Japan. This is Harvey Lee Oswald in the Marines. You'll notice on the bottom it says April 1959, Santa Ana, California. Well, I can tell you with certainty that Lee Oswald never went to Santa Ana, California. The last months that he was in the Marines, he was stationed mostly on mess duty at El Toro, which technically, while they're the same station, they're actually 7 miles apart from each other. The Santa Ana station was known as the Lighter Than Air Station, and it was a helicopter base, and it was run by the CIA. When Oswald defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, this is the photograph that they actually used to put in the newspapers. That is clearly not the man who was arrested on November 22nd, 1963. Evidence of the official use of Harvey Lee Oswald. Now, what you're going to see is absolute proof the government was well aware and behind the use of the name Harvey Lee Oswald. And they used the name Harvey Lee Oswald to obfuscate and to hide important information and top secret files. The employee roster at the Texas School Book Depository does not have Lee Harvey Oswald there. I need to remind everyone, Lee Harvey Oswald, Harvey Lee Oswald, I don't care what you call him. The person named Oswald that we're familiar with as Oswald never worked at the book depository. Ask yourself, what evidence have you seen that convinced you that Oswald worked at the book depository? Because when I ask myself that question, I don't have any. Every single alleged encounter with Oswald inside the book depository that day is easily explained by the presence of William Seymour, who was impersonating Oswald for the months leading up to the assassination, including at Sylvia Odio's, including the Sportsdrome rifle range, including the Havana Bar in New Orleans, including the Carousel Club on November 10th, where he was seen by Harvey Wade. William Seymour was impersonating Oswald up to and including his employment at the book depository. There's no evidence Oswald was ever there. So the insertion of the name Harvey Lee Oswald at 605 Elspeth, which wasn't his address, that was clearly inserted by someone who knew of the deception. The Texas School Book Depository was most certainly an intelligence connected. It's not a front, but it was a cutout. All of the publishers who worked inside that building were contractors with the CIA. 1950 census, the consolidated census rolls 5152. Oswald is listed as Harvey Oswald. And I need you to note that the birth date here is 10/19/39. That's not Oswald's birthday. His birthday was October 18th, 39. But as you'll see, we have a pattern that will form of Oswald's closest relatives using the wrong birthday for him on official documentation. So this is clear intelligence work. And we see it not only with Oswald, but we see it with Oswald's cousin, Marilyn Dorothea Moret, who we'll get to later on. On Oswald's initial Marine enlistment application, the name Harvey Lee Oswald was typed in, clearly erased, and then over it was typed Lee Harvey. This document has so many anomalies on it. I'm not even going to go into all of them here. I'll point one out here. It says eyes hazel. He's never had hazel eyes. Oswald's always had blue eyes. When Marguerite Oswald filed for Lee's dependency discharge from the Marines, she filed it under the name Harvey Lee Oswald, not Lee Harvey Oswald. Harold Weisberg, the investigator and researcher, located and requested copies of the Navy dossier on Harvey Lee Oswald from the Defense Intelligence Agency. However, they deny having such a record in their possession. Billy Joe Lord, who sailed to Europe with Oswald, not technically with him, but he was most certainly a babysitter, an intelligence babysitter. There were only 4 passengers on the Marion Lakes, which was the boat that took Oswald to Europe. Only 4. All of them were military, okay? An old military couple, Billy Joe Lord and Harvey Oswald. And we know it's Harvey Oswald because that's how he introduced himself to everyone on the boat. Harvey Lee Oswald. So, as you'll see, there's going to be a correlation between the use of the name Harvey Oswald and the date of birth 10/19/39. Okay, that will become apparent later on, and when we get through the Marine records later, that will become extremely apparent and why they did it that way. Here we go. Have some general reports. Harvey Lee Oswald. One thing I need to point out to you: when you're in law enforcement and you make a mistake on a report, what happens is it gets rejected by your supervisor and gets kicked back to you for correction because it has to be perfect because it's going to go before judges and whatnot, right? And all kinds of stuff like that. So here. We have the use of Harvey Lee Oswald in many documents, but they're never kicked back for correction, right? You shouldn't ever see the name Harvey Lee Oswald in a FBI report because that should be a mistake, right? And it should be corrected and kicked back for correction. Here we'll see dozens of examples where it's not only not kicked back for correction, but there are the use of Harvey Lee and Lee Harvey in the same paragraph. Jim Garrison and Bill Boxley discuss how many people the FBI called Oswald Harvey Lee Oswald. So I'm going to read this paragraph here. It's pretty fascinating. Yeah, well, they apparently have someone in the agency or in the bureau feeding them information because this involves some deaths of the people on the Bulgarian desk and the Hungarian desk, and maybe it was the Yugoslav desk. He's talking about deaths that happened at the CIA of people who worked at those desks in this time period. I've forgotten, but there were 3 of them involved. But in sitting down and working with them over a period of several months, I learned that all their contacts are with the Bureau. Now, the first day that Rothermel and I went out to have lunch, he said, "I'll tell you something confidentially. If you ever repeat me, I didn't say it." He said, "I don't know what Lee Harvey, they call him Harvey Lee Oswald." And this is an interesting point. If you just someday get time to make note of everyone who calls him Harvey Lee instead of Lee Harvey. But he says, "I don't know whether he was CIA or FBI, but I know for a fact Jack Ruby was on the FBI payroll." Now, Rothermel would know because he's in daily contact with every FBI agent in Dallas. So, at the FBI, they referred to Oswald as Harvey Lee. And Rothermel here told him, "If you repeat this, I didn't say it." More commentary reference to Jim Garrison, who knew that there were 2 Oswalds, as noted in this 1968 memo. He's talking about the Warren Commission, volume 19, page 584, medical examination. In September 59 in the service, height 71 inches, weight 150. Hair brown, eyes gray. His build is given as medium rather than slender. This examination was on his release from active duty. This 5'11" Marine then went and got a passport on which his height is still 5'11", shows up in Russia and has pictures taken with Marina, who's a little girl just over 5 feet tall. His pictures do not show him towering over her, as he would as if he were the same person who'd been in the Marines. Priscilla Johnson, the newspaper woman who interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald, reports him as 5'11" with brown hair and gray eyes. It is interesting. The taller Oswald is the gray-eyed one, and the shorter has blue eyes. This is a pretty consistent pattern through descriptions. Marguerite describes him as blue-eyed and having light brown wavy hair. The Oswald who entered the United States at New York was 5'6" and couldn't possibly be 5'11", even allowing for a couple inches of mistake. And then jumping down to the last paragraph. What this all means is anybody's guess. My guess is that the impersonation started in the Marines. Kerry Thornley said the Oswald he knew, and we'll get to Kerry Thornley, was about 5'5". And let's say that he knew Lee Harvey Oswald, who went into the Marines, as 5'8", but looked smaller. Bill Boxley said the CIA had successfully put over impersonations so that even mothers are fooled. Please remember, Harold, that Marguerite wanted to believe that her son had come back to her. She was crushed when he defected and needed to believe that he had seen the error of his ways. So Garrison, I don't know if he really didn't put two and two together on the totality of the Oswald deception, but he knew there were two because the evidence clearly indicates that. And the alternative to the evidence indicating that there were two is that all of the reports and all of the evidence that there were two Oswalds is faked to indicate and make it look like there were two when there were not. But that's a double, triple whammy. And these people aren't that smart. Well, they were back then, but I don't think that's the case. Today, they most certainly are not intelligent enough to pull off the double, triple whammy, as I call it. Naval intelligence document titled Harvey Lee Oswald. FBI report dated November 30th, 63, referring to the travel of Harvey Lee Oswald. And here in the same paragraph, you have both Harvey Lee Oswald, and you see the little circle above the name Oswald. That circle indicates that there's another alias known or name missing here. And it talks about Lee Harvey Oswald just several sentences later, right? So if this was a mistake, it would have been kicked back to the agent to correct it. This is here because it's not a mistake. More naval intelligence documents dated Harvey Lee Oswald, this one from the 5th of April, 1972, almost 10 years after the assassination, when the name Lee Harvey Oswald is etched into everyone's mind. Finally, an FBI document acknowledging Harvey Lee Oswald as an alias. So the ARRB, the Assassination Records Review Board, went to great lengths to determine whether or not the CIA station at Mexico City actually maintained a file under the name Harvey Lee Oswald. Of course they did, and they denied it. Many of the Russian documents have the name Harvey Lee Oswald, as we'll see coming up. The FBI used the name Harvey Lee Oswald when interrogating John Elrod, an associate of Jack Ruby, about the killing of Oswald. J.C. Day of the Identification Bureau of the Dallas Police used both names, Lee Harvey Oswald and Harvey Lee Oswald, while testifying before the Warren Commission. The Dallas Police were well aware of the Oswald duplicity, and this had to have come down from Cabell. Had to have. There's no other possible path unless there's back-end connections that I'm unaware about, which there might be. More checks by the FBI under the name Harvey Lee Oswald. Michael Hardin of the O'Neill Funeral Home, when he testified, he was questioned by Mr. Hubert on the, quote, violent death of Harvey Lee Oswald. So even the Warren Commission lawyers knew about this other name for Oswald. Earlene Roberts, manager 1026 North Beckley, testified that when the Dallas police arrived at her door, they repeatedly asked for Harvey Lee Oswald. Now, why would they do that? Because the name is on the roster of the Texas School Book Depository as Harvey Lee Oswald. However, that address was what, 604 Elspeth or 602 Elspeth, right? So how did they get this name wrong, but they got the address right? Allegedly, the story is they got the address from Ruth Payne. I don't buy that. I have conflicting stories on what Ruth Payne actually did that day and whether the cops ever even went to Ruth Payne's house at all that day. So, but that's going to be for another time. The FBI maintained a file, number 105-82555, entitled Harvey Lee Oswald, a.k.a. Internal Security, Russia, Cuba. Secret Service memo, Harvey Lee Oswald. Can you see the depths of how many of these organizations were aware of the name Harvey Lee Oswald? Marguerite Oswald received a telegram from someone who knew Oswald, and it was sent to the mother of Harvey Lee Oswald. HSCA records request for CIA for files under the name Harvey Lee Oswald, along with Lee Henry Oswald, which came up as kind of a whole nother covert operation unto itself. Clay Shaw, during a press conference in 1967, he addressed Oswald as Harvey Lee Oswald. And to be honest with you, this is to me one of the first indications that I saw that indicated to me that he might have actually known the person that we know as Oswald. Because I've never believed that. I never believed that. Oswald in New Orleans was kept at an arm's length from everybody except Kerry Thornley. Kerry Thornley directly managed Oswald in New Orleans. This is very easily provable when you come to understand that Kerry Thornley had the flyers printed at Jones Printing for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and that Terry Thornley is most likely the one who forged the documents in regards to contacting Vincent T. Lee about setting up a New Orleans chapter. The evidence of Terry Thornley having been Oswald's direct handler in New Orleans is overwhelming. Soviet citizenship request was submitted under the name Harvey Lee Oswald. CIA document referencing potential interest of Oswald due to the Harvey story. This is a pretty long document. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's fascinating, and it ties in conclusions that I made years ago without having corroborated them with this. In particular, it mentions Redwood and AE Ocean, which are connected to Red Skin and AE Balcony, which are the two programs that I identified as having been the ones that managed Oswald's trip to the Soviet Union. Subject, Mr. Lee Harvey Oswald to Walter Haltigan. One, it makes little difference now, but Redwood had at one time an interest in Oswald, an operational interest in Oswald. As soon as I heard Oswald's name, I recalled that as chief of the 6th branch, I had discussed sometime in summer 60 with the then chief and deputy chief of the 6th research station, and laying on of interview through Jump or other suitable channels. At the moment, I don't recall if this was discussed while Oswald and his family were en route to our country or if it was after their arrival. I remember that Oswald's unusual behavior in the USSR had struck me from the moment I had read the first OD acid dispatch on him. I told my subordinates something amounting to don't push too hard to get the information we need because this individual looks odd. We were particularly interested in the OI Oswald might provide on the Minsk factory in which he had been employed, on certain sections of the city itself, and of course, we sought the unusual BI that might help develop target personality dossiers. I was phasing into my LP cover assignment and out of KU Dove at the time. Thus, I would have left our country shortly after Oswald's arrival. I don't know what action developed thereafter. It's from Thomas B. Cassason. As an afterthought, I recall also that at the time I was becoming increasingly interested in watching develop a pattern that we had discovered in the course of our bio and research work in 6. The number of Soviet women marrying foreigners, being permitted to leave the USSR and then eventually divorcing their spouses and settling down abroad without returning home. The AE Ocean 3 case was among the first of these, and we eventually turned up something like 24 similar cases. We established links between some of these women in the KGB. KU desk became interested in developing the trend we had come across. It was partly out of curiosity to learn if Oswald's wife would actually accompany him to our country, partly out of interest in Oswald's own experience in the USSR, that we showed operational intelligence in the Harvey story. This sounds like a guy who knows exactly what he's talking about, was well aware of Oswald's activities, and it shows that he didn't have any idea that Oswald was there on an intelligence operation. This is how compartmentalized our intelligence community is. This is how you end up with CIA-backed terrorists fighting Pentagon-backed terrorists in Afghanistan. More FBI records under the name Harvey Lee Oswald. Here's another long story about Robert Tabor, founder of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, appearing with a Lieutenant Harvey Oswald in Cuba. I don't know that I buy this story at all. I have to look further into it. To me, the idea that you're going to continue to use your operational decoy post-1959 makes no sense. After 59, when Oswald becomes a public figure, the other Oswald has to disappear by how it has to be. You can't have two of them floating around. So therefore, I don't buy any stories of Lee Harvey Oswald, the real Oswald, appearing after 1959 until possibly interactions with Mae Brussels in the 1970s, which I'll talk about briefly later on. Dallas police, when they announced the killer of Tippit and JFK, they announced it to the newspapers as Harvey Lee Oswald, not Lee Harvey Oswald. According to Mrs. John D. Kilgore, Oswald had worked at Bilbo Trucking with her husband. She had met him once in 1956 when her husband had brought him home. She says this man was known to them as Harvey Oswald. According to John, he would see Oswald picking up a paycheck frequently. However, he never actually saw Oswald work any days. Now, there's definitely issue with this because this doesn't match the official story, right? But the reality is this was either Harvey Oswald or this was Robert Oswald, because Robert Oswald most certainly posed as his brother at certain times. throughout his life. Despite the fact that he's 6 years older than him, when you get into the older ages of like 13, 14, and 19 and 20, Robert Oswald was a very slim, small-looking man who looked a lot younger than he actually was. And there was a distinct possibility in a lot of places that he was using the name Lee Oswald and possibly Harvey Oswald. The name Harvey Lee Oswald was printed in newspapers stretching into the 1970s. All of these came out in the 1960s and 70s, all say Harvey Lee Oswald. See, when they release things like this through the newspapers, I have to wonder if this is some sort of covert operational messaging from one agency to another. William Gaudet, who is a full-time CIA employee who was tasked with observing Oswald in New Orleans. He knew everything about Oswald's background. He knew everybody who allegedly was associating at 544 Camp Street, Arcacha and Guy Bannister and all those guys. William Gaudet, when he spoke with Bud Fensterwall, he identified him as Harvey Oswald. Despite the subject of the CIA memo being labeled Oswald Lee Harvey, the author casually refers to Oswald as Harvey. It is requested that the recipients advise if the FBI is receiving information about Harvey on a continuing basis. If not, please furnish this office with the information which has not been provided to the FBI so that it may be forwarded to them. So, the name Harvey Oswald, again, I'm going to beat this into your head because it has to be beaten to your head. This is an intelligence deception. George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's alleged best friend, who was setting him up the whole time in Dallas, right? He referred to him as Harvey Lee Oswald when he talked to, was that Altman? Yeah. All right, and this is my favorite of them all. He has a brother named John Pick, and we'll get to some of the family stuff later on. But John Pick is a half-brother. He was not in on this deception, and he's pissed. When you read his Warren Commission testimony, it's obvious. He was deceived, and he ain't having it, and he's pissed. And you don't hear a damn word out of John Pick after the Warren Commission ever. And the guy lived for another 40 or 50 years, okay? When he met Oswald Thanksgiving 1962, he hadn't seen him in over 10 years. And the man who showed up at Thanksgiving was most certainly not his brother. When Oswald put his name and address in John Pick's address book on Thanksgiving 62, he signed the name Harvey. We're going to veer off to John Pick's Warren Commission testimony to drill this point home. Mr. Jenner is the lawyer for the Warren Commission who he's talking to. Mr. Jenner says, then right below that is a picture of a young man standing in front of an iron fence, which appears to be probably at a zoo. Do you recognize that? John Pick says, sir, from that picture, I could not recognize that is Lee Harvey Oswald. That young fellow shown there, he doesn't look like you recall Lee in 1952 and 1953 when you saw him in New York City? No, sir. Commission Exhibit 284, do you recognize anybody in that picture that appears to be Lee Oswald? John Pick, no, sir. There's a young fellow in the foreground. Everybody else is facing the other way. He's in a pantomime or grimace. Do you recognize that as Lee Harvey Oswald? No, sir. Looking at that picture, and I have looked at it several times, that looks more like Robert than it does Lee, to my recollection. All right, on exhibit number 286, the lower right-hand corner, there's another picture. Do you recognize as your brother Lee in that picture? Yes, sir, that is about, listen to what he says. Yes, sir, that is about how he looked when I seen him in 1962, his profile. Do you recognize the person, the lady to the right who was pointing her finger at him? He's talking about the Arlington Heights photograph, okay? So let me skip forward. Mr. Jenner says, all right, exhibit number 288, there is in the lower left-hand corner, there's a reproduction of a service card and a reproduction also of a photograph with the head of a man. Do you recognize that? That looks to me approximately how Lee Oswald looked when I seen him Thanksgiving 62. Remember, he's making a clear distinction now of how he appeared Thanksgiving 62 and how he knew him all of his whole life. Directing your attention to exhibit commission number 289, do you recognize any of the servicemen shown in that picture as your brother? So he's showing him a picture of Lee in the Marines. No, sir, I do not recognize them. Exhibit number 290, the lower left-hand corner, there's a photograph of a young lady and a young man. Do you recognize either of those persons? John Pick says, he appears to me as Lee Harvey Oswald in 1962 when I seen him. Again, he's making a distinction between when the Oswald he knew growing up and the Oswald he knew in 62. Now, when you saw him 10 years later, he was 23. Yes, sir. You noticed, did you, a material change, physically first, Let's take his physical appearance. Yes, sir. Physically, I noticed that. What did you notice? He was much thinner than I had remembered him. He didn't have as much hair. Did that arrest your attention? What was the material difference? Did that strike you? Yes, sir. It struck me quite profusely. What else did you notice about his physical appearance that arrested your attention? His face features were somewhat different, being his eyes were maybe set back. And like in these army pictures, they looked different than I remembered him. His face was rounder. Marilyn had described him to me when he went into the Marine Corps as having a bull neck. This I didn't notice at all. I looked for this, and I didn't notice this at all, sir. He seemed more slender. Yes, sir. He had materially less hair. Yes, sir. His eyes seemed a little sunken. Yes, sir. He's clearly describing another man who's not his brother, who showed up on Thanksgiving 1962 because the goddamn CIA thought they could pull one over on fucking John Pick, who's been in the goddamn military for like 10 fucking years at this point. Give me a fucking break. Give me a fucking break. In that picture right there on the lower right, that's Oswald with the fucking bull neck. That is Oswald, his brother, with the bull neck. That is not the man who showed up from the goddamn Soviet Union. The man in the photograph on the upper left, that photograph's a fake. The man who posed for that photograph was Kerry Thornley. Marina Oswald was in on the deception. And that face is Harvey Oswald, not Lee Oswald. This wasn't even like a secret. Newspapers and books were written about how there were multiple Oswalds, but history has a tendency to forget. Oswald's body was dug up. It was exhumed. And why was it exhumed? Because there was enough evidence to show that Oswald might not be Oswald as buried in Oswald's grave. That's why they exhumed the body. But yet they compared it. They didn't unwind the deception. And when you actually get to see, as we move forward, how deep this deception went, you'll realize that they never got any of this information before they came to that conclusion. And they based their determination on the fact that the Oswald that was dug up was the real Oswald because they were given Harvey Oswald's initial files, which all matched. This is what ties it all together. This is from Peter Dale Scott. This personnel file appears to be a compilation, whether from before or after the assassination is not clear. It collects copies of correspondence on Oswald from the files of at least 3 and probably more Marine commanders under which he served. As published in Folsom Exhibit Number 1, this personnel file contains only unclassified documents and information. There are no overt references to Marine G2 and only one passing reference to the existence of confidential intelligence records on Oswald in the Department of the Navy. This reference is in a letter of 29 July 1960, recommending Oswald's discharge from the Marines. The letter mentions 2 confidential reports from the 8th New Orleans and 9th Chicago Naval District's intelligence offices, which cites it as follows. And those are 2 serial numbers assigned to 2 confidential reports that were sent back and forth between New Orleans and Chicago. Years later, replying affirmatively to a request for these DIO reports from researcher Paul Hoke, the Naval Investigative Service, successor to ONI, supplied 2 records. These established a fact not available from the rest of the personnel file, that Marine G2 in regional offices as well as Marine headquarters received documentary information from this ONI district office concerning Oswald. In addition, at least one of these G2 records listed Oswald by a slightly different name. This alternative name, which eventually was used by at least 4 different military intelligence sources, was Harvey Lee Oswald. This Harvey Lee Oswald reference is no accidental anomaly, but part of an organized pattern, widely dispersed, that suggests an official intelligence deception and possible dual filing system. Serial number 02296E of 27 June 60 is the earliest Harvey Lee Oswald reference we now possess, over 24 of them, from the files of ONI, FBI, CIA, Army Intelligence, the Secret Service, the Mexican Secret Police, and the Dallas Police. A consistent pattern of behavior in these agencies since the assassination has been the tendency to suppress references to Harvey Lee Oswald and replace them with the more standard Lee Harvey Oswald. Boom. There you go. This has been known for decades. And, I get a lot of flack because I fucking detest Kennedy researchers because they're the lowest IQ fucking knuckle draggers that have ever walked planet Earth, because I've been on this literally for 8 months. Motherfuckers have had 60 years to figure this out. Give me a fucking break. No. 10/19/39. Throughout his life, Oswald's birthday often appeared as October 1939, when his actual birthday, as we're told, is October 18th, 1939. When Marguerite Oswald completed the application for the Bethlehem Orphan Asylum, which we'll get into a little more detail later on, she put his birthday as October 19th. This is allegedly his mother. Paperwork from the New York Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies dated 1/16/1953, when Marguerite, both of them, were in New York and trying to get Oswald into schools and help and all this because he was a truant, and we'll cover that in story in excruciating detail later on. She used the birth date 10/19/39, and she seems to have forgotten Oswald's father's name, and she said that his name was either James or John, which is not true, right? So what's going on here? Why are parents of children putting wrong information? What possible answers could there be? The Social Service Exchange in New York City was given 10/19/39 for Oswald's birthday. Again, information provided by Marguerite Oswald. Besides the incorrect birth dates, Marguerite told John Caro that Oswald's father's name was Lee Harvey. Okay, it's not. Oswald's father's name was allegedly Robert Edward Lee Oswald Sr. So, again, why does she do this? Why is she giving wrong information on official documentation? Because this is an intelligence deception. Oswald's death certificate, okay, has October 19th, 1939, and this information was provided by Robert Oswald, his alleged brother. Actually, I do believe it is his brother, for real. Both of them, which we'll talk about a little later on. This is fascinating, and this is very telling. When Marina Oswald applied for Social Security benefits based on Oswald's death, she provided a birth date of October 19th, 1939, but guess what? The only records that they had for Oswald with October 1939 birth date are the jobs that he had when he got back from the Soviet Union. It didn't include the Marine time. It didn't include Tujagues or any of the other jobs that he allegedly had, period. It started with the Leslie Welding Company in 1962, right? And it said he only made $3,500 in his whole life. This is called a clue, people. In a letter sent to John Pick, November 1954, Marguerite Oswald says Lee's birthday is October 19th. It's false, or so we're told, right? They can't keep the story straight. Oswald's Soviet visa contains the wrong birth date. Here it indicates a birthday of 19, and then there's a Russian word in 1938. And the commentary on it said that it was like December, but I tried looking up the Russian words for it, and I couldn't verify that. All we know is it does not say October 18th, 1939. All right. Oswald's family. Oswald's father is allegedly Robert Edward Lee Oswald. That's the only known photograph of him. Personally, I think it looks like a photograph of J. Walton Moore, who's a totally other guy in the Kennedy story, but that's a whole nother story. That's on the right-hand side, Marguerite Frances Claverie, Oswald's mother. She is one of the most disgusting, vile, fucking sociopaths I've ever come across in my research. She had a fucking black heart and no soul. And you'll understand that as I go further through this. So Robert Oswald allegedly died of a heart attack in August of 39. Did he really die of a heart attack in 39? Was he really Robert Oswald? Or was he a guy named Lee Oswald? As we move forward, let me see if I have this one coming up. You'll see that the information we're given on him is questionable at best. Lower left here, that's Robert Edward Lee Oswald Jr., known as, for the remainder of this presentation, will be called Robert Oswald. He is most certainly in on this deception, and by the facial features, to me, it's pretty clear that he's actually brothers with the Oswald who was arrested on November 22nd. So Robert Edward Lee Oswald was a short guy, about 5'5", with dark brown hair and eyes. Oswald was a little bit taller than that, and he had lighter brown hair, and he had blue or gray eyes. Just like Harvey Oswald, who is Robert Oswald's brother. So Robert Edward Lee Oswald's brother is Harvey Francis Oswald. He was a couple of years older than him, and he is actually a little taller, and he had gray eyes and light brown hair, just like both of the Lee Oswalds. As you'll see, and when we get to the next document, as Robert Oswald's dead, I'll tell the story real quickly. So Robert Oswald fucking dies. He dies in August of 39. Marguerite Oswald wanted him buried the same day, and she didn't call the family. Okay. I don't even remember the story on how they found out, but she did not contact them, and she was going to have him buried, and that was that. And Robert Oswald ended up being buried the next day in the Claverie family tomb, not the Oswald family tomb, which I find to be absolutely fucking unbelievable. That's shocking. Because of this, there was a gross falling out between Robert Oswald's family, which was very large. He had multiple brothers, Harvey, William. He had some sisters. Basically, when they found out that he died and Marguerite wanted to bury him that same day, they thought that was the most horrific thing they'd ever heard of. And after that, they never had any contact with her ever. The only person who maintained any contact, and only for a short time, was Harvey Francis Oswald, who was the one who signed off on Oswald. Oswald doesn't have a birth certificate, doesn't exist. Anyone who tells you it exists is a liar. It's referenced in the Marine files, but we don't have a copy of it. What we actually have is a copy of something called a witness to live birth, which was filed about 4 days after Oswald's birth, and it was signed by Harvey Oswald. This is the last known interaction that we have between Harvey Francis Oswald and Marguerite Claverie Oswald, and this is in the first week of this is in the last week of October 1939. After this, there will be basically no contact between Marguerite and the rest of the family, and I think I have a slide on that coming up. John Edward Pick is Oswald's half-brother from Marguerite and her former marriage to Edward John Pick Jr. Okay? So he's not in on this scheme. Not at all. He basically goes off and joins the Marines, or he joins the Coast Guard as young as possible. He's in for 6 years. Then he gets out and he joins the Air Force. He happens to be in Japan when Oswald's in Japan, and when Oswald's cousin, Marilyn Dorothea Moret, ends up going to Japan, as we'll talk about much. Actually, we're going to talk about that here coming up really soon. But John Pick seems to be the only straight shooter in this whole bunch. Both sides of the family were very large. But nobody ever has contact with them after the death of Robert Oswald. And I think I know why, besides the fact that Marguerite Oswald was just a disgusting human being. Is because they were no longer living in New Orleans at a time when they would have been, as we're told. Okay, so when it comes to Robert Edward Lee Oswald, we have some weird anomalies that I have yet to be able to figure out. So he was called Lee Oswald. He was called Lee Oswald. Some documents show him as Robert Edward Oswald. Some show Robert Lee Oswald. Some show, various combinations of those names. But I believe John Armstrong submitted this to try to get some clarification on directory listings and Oswald, and I'll go ahead and I'll read this paragraph. The 1933 city directory listed Herman G. Engelhart, who worked insurance with Robert Oswald, agent of MetLife Insurance Company residing at 706 Moss, and Lee Oswald, agent of MetLife Insurance Company residing at 202 South Scott. There were no Edward Oswalds, Robert E. Oswalds, or Robert L. Oswalds. In the 1935 one, Herman G. Engelhart's entry gave his only residence as 706 Moss. Lee Oswald's read agent of MetLife Insurance Company residing at 808 Taft Place. There were 2 Robert Oswalds, both residing at 917 Teach. Okay, so these 2 Robert Oswalds living at 917 Teach are related to Oswald, but through the son of Norman Oswald, who's a couple cousins distant. So they didn't even know that there's a connection. But throughout my investigation into New Orleans and Oswald and Robert Oswald, these other 2 Oswalds kept popping up. Both of them are military. And Robert Oswald, I think his middle initial is N, if I'm not mistaken. He was in the Army or the Marines as a super duper high up lieutenant or something, right? So, but on paper, there's no technical connection between these families, despite some weird anomalies that I'm not ready to talk about because they need further fleshing out. The 1938 directory listed Lee Oswald and his wife Marguerite. He was an agent for MetLife Insurance Company and resided at 1917 Gallier. There were no H. Engelhart, Robert Oswald, or Edward Oswald, right? So basically the point of this whole thing is, who the fuck is this guy? Is he Robert Edward Lee Oswald, or is he Lee Oswald? When you go through the testimony of the Warren Commission, what you will find is that Robert Oswald, the senior, is never ever referred to as Robert Oswald ever. He's always 100% of the time referred to as Lee Oswald. It's almost like everyone is in on it. Like the lawyer and the person being questioned are both in on the notion that they're not going to refer to him as Robert Edward Lee Oswald. I don't know why. But that tells me that he was most certainly part of some kind of deception, because the one thing that's never mentioned anywhere is the fact that Robert Oswald fought in World War I. So he was in the military, just like Harvey Oswald, his brother. These are documents that we need. We're never going to get. You think we're going to get fucking documents on Harvey Francis Oswald from goddamn 1896? No, we're not. Okay. God, stop drinking the Kool-Aid. William Stout Oswald Jr. had never seen or known Oswald, but yet when he spoke of him, he called him Harvey Lee, which is weird. This is just indicating that Harvey Oswald was the uncle. So I gathered all these statements from all the Oswalds who were living in New Orleans. All of the Oswalds in New Orleans were related to Oswald, whether they knew it or not, through distant cousins or whatever. It seems like once you get past second cousins, like nobody gives a fuck anymore. So yeah, but I put this up here to show that none of these people ever interacted with Oswald. I mean, they all lived together in New Orleans for decades, and there's just no contact at all until Harvey Oswald makes it up to New Orleans in June of 1963, and he begins to investigate his heritage, which gives me some clear indicators that these people are family, and that the idea that he was plucked from a concentration camp or any of that stuff that Armstrong put forth is most certainly incorrect. Now, this doesn't answer the Russian question. How the fuck does Oswald speak Russian? I tell you what, there ain't a goddamn person on planet Earth who knows. But after I get finished with this, that's my next mission, and I'm going to know. There's a significant possibility the person who spoke Russian isn't any of these Oswalds. More statements from the family. Okay, so in 1963, Oswald reaches out to Hazel Oswald, who is the wife of William Stout Oswald Sr., who's dead a long time at this point, 10, 15 years. And so Oswald is going, Harvey Oswald, the one who was arrested on November 22nd, 63, the one who you know as Lee Harvey Oswald, he gets to New Orleans and he's going through the phone book and he's calling all of the Oswalds because he's trying to find out more about his past and his history. That's obviously what he's doing. He gets a hold of Hazel Oswald and she explains that William Oswald's dead. They're all dead. Harvey's dead. And that she had a picture of Robert Edward Lee Oswald Sr., and that Oswald could come and get the photo, could come and pick it up, and he did. And so I'm going to refer to him as Harvey Oswald, comes to meet with Hazel Oswald. He receives this picture. I'm assuming it's the picture that we all know that we just saw of Robert Oswald Sr. We'll never really know, though. And she makes some very interesting statements when she's questioned by the FBI about that, specifically that he introduced himself as Harvey. So Hazel Oswald was married to William Stout Oswald Sr., Robert E. Lee Oswald's brother. And when she spoke to the FBI, she repeatedly called him Harvey. So, despite not being related, Jules J. Oswald, also employed by William B. Riley Coffee Company. They actually are related but it's distant. It's a couple cousins away. But the point here is that the Riley Coffee Company owned other coffee franchises, the Standard Coffee, Allied Coffee. It was a whole bunch of coffee. It was all CIA fronts, okay? What these guys do is the people leave the CIA and they go into independent business, and then they return favors to the CIA by putting fake people on payrolls and stuff like that. It's not really that big a deal. Or, Riley himself was probably no longer a spy, even though he was connected to, he was Jack Schultz. Was that his name? Jack Schultz, I believe that was the name, who was connected to all these companies. But, Riley Coffee employed three Oswalds, Jules J. Oswald and William Stout Oswald and our Oswald at Standard. Coincidence? You tell me. All right. Interesting stuff here. Oswald had a first cousin named Floy Oswald, a.k.a. Mrs. William Brown, a.k.a. Floy Oswald Brown. It appears J. Edgar Hoover had a personal file on Floy Oswald, who also seems to have used numerous aliases. So this is a fascinating note here by Armstrong. And down here it says, because it has her name and has a whole bunch of, look at all these case numbers. This is all about Oswald's cousin, right? I have not particularly looked up these indicators. Like you see a 100 and a 165, 87, 121. Those are what type of case they are, right? I did the breakdown of that for Jack Valenti in my book and showed that his father was connected to all kinds of mob stuff and racketeering and treason and all kinds of stuff, right? But I haven't done that for this yet. This will be in my book when I complete it. But There was a 67 file, and I'll read what this says. It says, okay, John, 67 files are Mr. Hoover's special eyes only, maybe 3 or 4 people. Why would an obscure Oswald relative be in such a super secret file? Interesting, huh? So I think we can assume at some level that this Oswald is somehow connected to this deception. Floyd Oswald Brown will also be murdered in her house. She'll be murdered by a live-in caretaker and 2 friends who attempted to force her to sign over property deeds. There's virtually no information on Floyd Oswald Brown. Everything you just saw is all that exists on her, period. This is Edwin Ekdahl. This was Marguerite Oswald's 3rd husband. They were together from 42 to 46. They weren't divorced until 48. Ekdahl was truly loved by Lee. It's the first time he ever had, the real Lee. It's the first time that he ever had a father figure, really, because his brothers kind of ignored him most of the time. And so when Ekdahl came into his life, they formed a very, very strong bond. Whether or not that played any role in subsequent events, I just don't know. All right. Now we have to talk about Lillian Claverie Moret and John Armstrong and his failures. If you'll notice, the woman on the left is clearly the woman in the middle on the right. That's Lillian Moret. John Armstrong made the photograph here on the left a cornerstone of his research, and he botched this so poorly, it's embarrassing. If you'll notice, the curtain in the background is identical, okay? This is not 126 Exchange Place. This is Lillian Moret's house at 737 French Street in New Orleans, okay? Which used to be 804 French Street because they changed the numbers sometime around 1953, 54. But this picture here on the left is this weird-looking woman who's younger is Oswald's cousin. It's Marilyn Dorothea Moret, the woman with the guy's got his arm around her. That's Lillian Moret. And then that young man right there, this is crazy. For the last 10 years, I thought that was Oswald till about 2 weeks ago. And then it dawned on me that that's not Oswald. That is most likely John Eugene Moret, who's the youngest son of Lillian Moret, who was the one who took Oswald to Mobile, Alabama, or somewhere in Alabama, and they talked at the Jesuit college about Oswald's experience. I need to do a deep dive into that trip because there's more to it than we're being told. And you can see Marilyn Dorothea Moret, she's got a very unique face. She's really weird looking. But where Armstrong really fucked up is, as you'll see moving forward, if you're going to have 2 Oswalds, you have to have 2 mothers to take care of them. And he believed that the woman on the left was the false Marguerite Oswald that you'll see in the slides that I have coming up. He got that wrong. That was a cornerstone of his research, and he botched it. Also, what he botched, another thing he botched that he didn't realize he botched, but that solved a lot for me, was later on, we'll get into the Palmer McBride stuff in 1957-58, and Palmer McBride will identify the photograph on the left as the woman who he believed was Marguerite Oswald, right? So this is why John Armstrong believed that this woman was the false Marguerite, but she's not, okay? But what it proved to me was that this Lillian Moret was in on the deception and aided in raising Oswald from the time he was a child and in participating in some of the deception at a minimum in 1957, 1958, at the exact same time when Palmer McBride will allege Oswald was in New Orleans working for Fisher Dental Lab, when actually I can show with certainty that 2 Oswalds were in the Marines in Corregidor and Atsugi. So what am I saying here? I'm saying John Armstrong fucked up. That is not the false Marguerite. That is Marguerite Oswald's real sister, Lillian. As you can tell, it's the same woman in the right. And so, yeah, she played a part in this deception, and we'll see this as we move forward. Marilyn Dorothea Moret, that's the woman on the left here. She is a spook, just like her mother, just like her aunt, just like this entire goddamn family. Marilyn Moret was described in a news article by Paul Scott as one of the most wanted defectors to Russia or satellite countries. And I'll go ahead and I'll read this. Referenced letter enclosed a memorandum containing information that one Paul Scott had written a newspaper column in which he had named Moret as one of the most wanted defectors to Russia or satellite countries. In interview, Scott advised that he had some information to make a tie-up between Moret and the Oswald case. He apparently did not know Miss Moret and Oswald were cousins. In his newspaper column, Scott mentioned a Professor Harold Isaacs of Massachusetts Institute of Technology as being associated with Moret. In reference letter, he told the commission he would furnish the background information on Isaacs. There's no evidence to support any of Scott's allegations about Moret and Isaacs. She was interviewed at length, and she was related to Oswald. Apparently, had very little association with him. The enclosure has been read and approved by Mr. Malley and Mr. Belmont. So Marilyn Moret was outed to this reporter, who then writes an article, and I have the article somewhere. I didn't clip it, but I have it somewhere, where he basically names her in a long list of people, including God, what was that guy's name? There was another false defector to Russia who was very famous, who was actually a naval intelligence spy who came back. The name will hit me in a minute. But his name was listed in this article also, and so was Marilyn Moret. Okay, so when things slip through like this, you kind of got to know that they're true, right? So he had good information, and this was obviously suppressed. So the FBI investigated Marilyn Moret and pulled her travel schedule beginning in 1954, and she made many unusual trips around the world, first claiming to be a reservation agent for a travel company, later claiming to be a teacher. So this is very interesting. Marilyn Dorothea Moret, born July 14th, 1928, New Orleans, Louisiana, living at 3730 Lindell Boulevard, St. Louis, was first issued United States passport number 436517 on July 13th, 54, for proposed travel via air from New York City, July 24th, 54, to England, France, Germany, and Holland on a 3-week vacation. I'm not going to read much else there, but that 3-week vacation became like many, many months, and she ended up as a teacher in China and all kinds of places in Eastern Bloc countries. And what the fuck what are we doing in 1955 going to Eastern Bloc countries? Normal people don't do that shit. All right, so one thing that came out very recently that no one else has uncovered except for me, of course, is that Lillian Marilyn Moret flew to an Air Force base in Bermuda, Kindley Air Force Base in Bermuda in September 1954, which is fascinating because this is sandwiched by the issuance of her passport and the travels that the FBI was following her on, right? So between those two fucking events, she gets flown to an Air Force base in Bermuda with her mother. Duh. These people are fucking spooks. Okay, also, Lillian Moret. Why the fuck did she fly to Cuba in February of 1955? And why does this never come up at the Warren Commission? Why was she never questioned about it? Why has not a single person on God's green earth ever mentioned the fact that Lillian fucking Moret went to Cuba in February 1955? I think that's kind of important, don't you? Should have been brought up at the Warren Commission and the ARB and the HSCA, which were all fucking shill enterprises. This is what fucking pisses me off. This shit was so obvious that these people are all spooks. And this has all been suppressed to death. All right. The picture on the left, that's Marilyn Moret at Louisiana State University, 1948. Okay. On the right, that's Ruth Payne. For the context of this entire presentation, she's irrelevant. I just wanted to show this because of the picture of Marilyn Moret on the left. You can tell she got a weird looking fucking face, right? Well, when you go and you actually look up the yearbook information for Marilyn Moret, that's what you get. That's who we're told is Marilyn Moret at Louisiana State University in 1948. That is not the same woman on the right who we know for fact is Marilyn Moret. Okay? Is this his chance that Oswald's involved in some identity transfer operation and so is his cousin? Did she even really go to Louisiana State? She went to Baylor after this, I think, or Loyola, actually. And Baylor is where Armstrong's documents are held. But this is a clear intelligence deception. All right. The most fascinating of all Oswald's relatives, who's not in the picture really, is Paul Auguste Polo Voitier Jr. He was one of Huey Long's bodyguards and most likely one of his assassins because there were two guys who were his primary bodyguards. Voitier, who was Marguerite Oswald's uncle. Voitier and one other guy, and then Huey Long gets shot by his own guys. That's how that went down.